For those of you who may be liturgical nerds, today is technically the last day of the church year. We call it Christ the King Sunday. Next Sunday is the first Sunday in Advent. We begin a whole cycle in a new church year. Normally, or typically, quite often, Thanksgiving Sunday and Christ the King occur on the same Sunday, and I usually choose to celebrate Thanksgiving over Christ the King because I really like Thanksgiving. So today is Christ the King, but I'm not going to preach about it. I'd already preached on one of the texts, and I really wanted to spend some time with something that's kind of been working on me for actually 2 or 3 months. And this is from the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7, and here's what Jesus says. Don't judge so that you won't be judged. You'll receive the same judgment you give. Whatever you deal out will be dealt out to you. Why do you see the splinter that's in your brother's or sister's eye, but don't notice the log in your own eye? The gospel of the Lord. Would you pray with me, please? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength, our Redeemer. Amen. Her name was Karen Cook. I believe we were freshmen in high school, could have been sophomores, but we shared a couple of classes together at Berkner High School. This was back in the mid-1970s. Often as one class dismissed, we found ourselves walking down the school hallway together to get to our next class. She had long blonde hair, was really kind of cute. She wore glasses and had a mouthful of orthodontics, braces. But as far as I was concerned, none of that really detracted from her beauty. This is how I remember her. But I think she actually looked more like this. If you put braces on that girl, that looks a lot like her. Of course, I myself was rather awkward and clumsy, not really sure how to talk to or connect with a cute girl like her. You know, this was new territory for me. So as class was dismissed each day, I found any excuse to talk to her, to walk next to her, to try to gain her attention in some way. And to her great credit, she was always very gracious and very kind. And then one day, as we were walking down H Hall at Berkner High School, I can't remember what motivated me to say it, but I did. I mentioned to her that my friends kiddingly referred to her as brace face. Without saying a word, she turned to me, took my forearm into her hands, and dug her long, sharp fingernails into my flesh, enough so that I began to bleed, all the while smiling through that charming glint of stainless steel. And I was left thinking, maybe she likes me. You know, for an adolescent boy, even negative attention is still attention. Not a smart move on my part, and to this day, I bear the scars of having called someone an awful name, something I immediately regretted and am really embarrassed to admit today. You know, there's that childhood rhyme that says, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. You remember that? The truth is, words do hurt. And it really does hurt when we call people names. It hurts to be called names, doesn't it? Our words can and do cause harm and damage when we speak unthinkingly, and especially when we speak maliciously. Name-calling hurts. I don't like it, and if you're honest, you probably don't like it either. And yet we live in a culture that is increasingly coarse and rude, fueled, in my opinion, by social media through which we can anonymously call others names and tear others down without ever having to look that person in the eye. You can get on social media and trash your next door neighbor. You can talk about Democrats or Republicans. You can talk about that person who cut in front of you in the McDonald's drive-thru. without them ever knowing it. I was just on Twitter this past week, and a pastor posted a comment about his church. It was a pretty innocent comment, in my opinion, but then he got ripped apart by literally hundreds of people who righteously took him to task because of what he said. It was all finger-pointing and accusation without any real conversation or discussion, without a bit of humility or any attempt to understand what he meant by his comment. I've mentioned this before. The letter of James tells us that everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger, which I think is pretty good advice. And yet we, yes, even we Christians, so often do it backwards. We are slow to listen. We're quick to speak. And sometimes I think we're even eager to get angry or offended by something. Do you hear what Jesus says to us in the Sermon on the Mount? Don't judge so that you won't be judged. Too often, I think we trivialize this statement and we use it for self-serving purposes. When somebody criticizes us, don't judge me, right? But I really believe there's quite a bit more to what Jesus is telling us. The Franciscan teacher Richard Rohr has helped me understand Jesus' teaching in a new and slightly different way. Richard Rohr suggests that when Jesus tells us not to judge, what he's saying is, don't label. Do not put labels on other people. The danger, he says, is that once you compare or label things, that is, judge them, you must almost always conclude that one is good and the other is less good or even bad. In other words, more often than not, when you put a label on somebody, or I dare say when you call somebody a name, you elevate yourself and you put down the other. Rohr explains in this way. He says, don't take my word for it. Just notice your own thoughts and reactions. You'll see that you'll move almost automatically into a pattern of up or down, in or out, for me or against me, right or wrong, black or white, gay or straight, good or bad. It is the basic reason why the stinking thinking of racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, religious imperialism, and prejudice of all kinds is so hard to overcome and has lasted so long, even among nice people. Which is why Jesus, along with so many of the other great spiritual teachers, stressed that we should not judge. That we should be wary of putting a label on another person. Because once we do, we limit our ability to understand or relate to that person who may actually be different from us. And Jesus, of course, makes it even plainer for you and me in case we don't understand. He asks a rhetorical question for us to ponder. Why do you see the splinter that's in your brother or sister's eye, and yet you don't notice the log that's sticking out of your own eye? Well, the answer is both simple and obvious. It is easier to label someone else as the real problem rather than doing the hard work of looking within our own souls. It's easier to extend judgment to everybody else around us rather than looking inside and recognizing our own contribution to whatever mess we're in. It is easier to name another person as the enemy and the source of all our problems, rather than to confess our own brokenness and corruption. And we call that process scapegoating. For your own benefit and for the benefit of God's kingdom, Jesus says to us, don't judge people. Do not put useless labels on other people. Do not paint others with broad brushstrokes that limit your capacity for human understanding and for human connection. Eugene Peterson takes great liberty in paraphrasing Jesus' words, but I think he's spot on in getting to the heart of what Jesus is saying. Don't pick on people, jump on their failures, criticize their faults, unless, of course, you want the same treatment. That critical spirit has a way of boomeranging. It's easy to see a smudge on your neighbor's face and be oblivious to the ugly sneer on your own. My brothers and sisters, this may be as hard for you to hear as it is hard for me to say. But the purpose of the ethical teaching of Jesus is not to affirm our own prejudices, biases, and fears. Jesus did not come to sanctify the status quo and the way things are. The purpose of Jesus' ethical teaching is to challenge us and ultimately to transform us into a new way of thinking and a new way of behaving. The ethical teaching of Jesus isn't to reinforce our own stinking thinking, but to force us to look at the world and to interact with it in a very different way. And if you doubt that, listen to what else Jesus teaches us. Jesus says, you must love your neighbor as you love yourself. And if you have any question about who your neighbor is, in Luke 10 he tells a story of a bad guy doing the right thing, while the good guys, the religious folk, in fact, do absolutely nothing. It's called the parable of the Good Samaritan, if you haven't heard of it. Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Love means respecting the dignity, the human dignity of your enemy. Pray for them. And he further reminds us that God makes the sun to rise on both good folks and bad folks. He sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Furthermore, he says, if you love only those who love you, there's no reward in it because everybody does that. You're just like everybody else. And get this, if you're really tempted to label somebody as the enemy, then Jesus commands you to love them. And that ought to make you think twice. I myself have been deeply convicted many times by the words of 1 John, where it says, those who say, I love God and hate their brothers or sisters are liars. For those who do not love a brother or sister whom they have seen can't possibly love God whom they haven't seen. Enough said. My friends, will you look inside yourself before you spew out judgment and criticism? Will you think twice before you label someone else or name call someone whom you find threatening or challenging? Will you be attentive to the log that's sticking out of your own eye before you attempt to remove the splinter that's in the eye of another person? Do not judge. Don't label others because it only seems to boomerang and come right back at you. In elementary school, we had a very clever way of identifying who was in and who was out, who was okay and who was not okay. They were called cooties. You've heard of cooties. They had them in Illinois as well as Texas, right? Now, this was very serious business back in the third grade. You see, girls didn't want boy cooties, and boys didn't want girl cooties, and any physical contact with the opposite sex gave you that person's cooties. But not only that, they were highly contagious because you could also get cooties by touching something that a girl had just touched or sitting in a chair that a girl had previously occupied. And the only way you could get rid of cooties was to pass them on to someone else, and then it became their problem, right? Now, one girl's cooties were worse than anyone else's, and her name was Barbara Miller. She had a male equivalent, David Ramsey. Cooties were bad enough, but Barbara Miller cooties were the worst. In fact, they're the worst of the worst. And you might as well be dead if you ever came into contact with Barbara or if somebody ever gave you her cooties. And both boys and girls went to great lengths to avoid getting Barbara Miller cooties. In fact, if you saw her coming your way, you'd turn around and run. As a kid, it seemed like a fun and harmless game we were playing among ourselves. But as an adult, I'm horrified to think of the hurt that we caused Barbara. I cannot imagine the ridicule and scorn and humiliation that we just heaped upon Barbara through our childish behavior. And yeah, she's a little bit different, but I really have no idea why we singled her out for all of our ridicule and taunts. We slapped a big label on her that she was weird, she was odd, and nobody needed to be her friend. As adults, honestly, we play that same game, but in different ways. We don't call it cooties, but we find more clever ways of excluding others and labeling them as different or strange or odd, or perhaps even as the enemy. Jesus says, you'd better be careful when you judge. You better be careful when you ostracize or label others or call them by hurtful names, because it may well boomerang right back into your own face. I want to conclude with a video that's a bit different from what I normally show you. It's also a bit long, about 4.5 minutes, but I first saw this when I was in Dallas this summer at the Uniting Methodists Conference. It comes from what I understand to be an actual experiment in Europe. It was filmed in Poland. And it's based on the research of a psychologist who says that 4 minutes of eye contact will bring people closer to each other more than anything else. So this video shows complete strangers of all kinds, meeting one another for the first time, and they are asked to look into one another's eyes for 4 minutes. So let's dim the lights and pay attention to the screens and see what happens.
Nice mustache. Six, five. Mit 6, 5.
Are you new in Baden?
Yeah, 8 months.
And are you alone here or with your family?
No, I don't. This life, sometime nice, sometime not good.
I can. I'm keeping my eyes on you. Wow.
Wow.
Hello.
I expect him to ask my number.
Be a strong man.
Thank you so much. We will go to the zoo. Maybe next this few days. Text you if you would like to.
I would love it. Of course, you can do it.
When I was looking into her eyes, I was trying to see what I could tell from the life that she lived, and I think I could tell that there was a lot of experience lived there.
It doesn't matter, look at the eyes or something, just give yourself a chance to talk and to look at the other person.
My brothers and sisters, before we slap a label on somebody, before we call them different, before we call them by some name, before we post something hateful on social media about somebody else, what if we took a moment to look in their eyes and recognize that within that person's soul is the image of God, and that they are fellow children of God? If we did that, it might begin to change the world. Amen. Remember our app, our website, findhopedowntown.org, through which you can give, stay connected, or watch sermon videos that you might have